The deadly battlefield. The planet was dying. Its surface, once full of life and vibrant colors, was now scorched by endless fires. The sky was darkened with smoke, and the ground shook with the heavy thuds of battle. The sounds of laser blasts and explosions echoed across the barren land, as soldiers from two worlds fought in an unrelenting struggle for survival. Among the chaos, Sergeant Carter moved with precision. A human Marine, hardened by years of combat, he was used to the madness of war. But today, it felt different. The air was thick with the scent of burning debris, and the ground was littered with the wreckage of destroyed vehicles and fallen soldiers. Earth had sent its best to defend this world, but even they were starting to feel the weight of the war. The enemy was fierce, an alien species known as the Zorveki. Carter's eyes scanned the horizon. His squad had just taken cover behind a broken building, the remnants of a once proud structure that now served as little more than shelter. The Zorveki soldiers were relentless, advancing with brutal force. Their armor was dark, almost metallic, and their eyes glowed with an eerie red light, a sign of their alien nature. But Carter had seen worse. He had survived far more dangerous battles, and he had no intention of falling today. "Sergeant, we're outnumbered," Private Reynolds said, his voice shaky as he peered over the edge of the debris. "What do we do?" Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he raised his rifle and aimed it at the advancing enemy. The Zorveki were getting closer, their weapons charged and ready. Carter's mind raced. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. "Hold your fire," Carter ordered, his voice calm and steady. "We wait for the right moment. Stick to the plan." The soldiers around him nodded, their faces hard with resolve. They had trained for moments like this. But as the minutes passed, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that the enemy was preparing for something big. The Zorveki were closing in, their advanced weapons now locked on their position. Carter knew they didn't have much time. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. Carter's eyes widened. The enemy had deployed their heavy artillery. The blast was deafening, shaking the very foundation of the ruined building. Carter grabbed Reynolds and pulled him down just as a blast of energy tore through the air above them. The explosion sent debris flying, and dust filled the air, obscuring their vision. For a moment, everything was chaos. The world seemed to spin, and Carter's heart raced. But he knew he couldn't afford to panic. He crawled through the dust, his breath shallow, his rifle still clutched tightly in his hands. He could hear the shouts of his squad members, but everything sounded distant and muffled. When the dust finally cleared, Carter looked around. The building they had been using as cover was now nothing but a pile of rubble. But somehow, they were still alive. The squad was scattered, but they were intact. Carter quickly took stock of the situation. Reynolds was still with him, but several of the other soldiers were missing. "Where's Jenkins?" Carter called out, his voice tense. Reynolds looked around, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know, Sergeant. He was with me a second ago." Carter's heart skipped a beat. Jenkins was a good soldier, and if he was missing, there was a chance he might be in danger. Carter had to find him. "Reynolds, stay here," Carter ordered. "I'm going after Jenkins." Without waiting for a response, Carter took off, moving quickly through the rubble. His training kicked in, and he moved with the precision of a predator. The battlefield was dangerous, but Carter had been in worse. He knew how to survive. He scanned the area, looking for any signs of movement. A few yards away, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, partially hidden behind a shattered wall, was an alien warrior. The Zorveki soldier was lying motionless, his body broken and battered. He was badly injured. His dark armor was scorched, and his once glowing eyes were now dim. The alien had been left behind by his own people, abandoned to die. Carter hesitated. It wasn't unusual for the Zorveki to leave their wounded behind. They were ruthless in battle, with little regard for the lives of their own kind once they were deemed useless. But something about this alien warrior made Carter stop. The Zorveki soldier's chest rose and fell, his breathing shallow but still steady. Carter could see the pain in his eyes, but there was something else there too. A spark of life, a will to survive. And in that moment, Carter realized that this warrior, this enemy, was not unlike himself. They were both fighting to stay alive in a brutal world. Carter crouched down, his rifle still in his hands. He wasn't sure what drove him, but he couldn't leave the alien to die. He had to do something. The battle raged on around him, but for just a moment, everything else faded away. The alien warrior, lying there in the dirt, was in need of help, and Sergeant Carter, against all odds, was the only one who could offer it. The alien's struggle. The dust hung heavy in the air, and the remnants of the battlefield were eerily quiet for a moment. Sergeant Carter knelt by the fallen Zorveki warrior, his rifle slung over his shoulder as he carefully examined the alien. His heart raced, but he fought to stay calm. The situation was precarious. They were deep in enemy territory, and the Zorveki were closing in on their position. The alien warrior's breathing was labored. Blood seeped from a wound in his side, and his dark armor was badly scorched. His glowing eyes flickered dimly, and Carter could see the pain etched across his face. But it was the alien's will to survive that caught Carter's attention. Despite the injuries, the alien was alive, and not just alive, but fighting to hold on. Carter had seen death many times before. He'd watched comrades fall in battle, and had even lost part of himself in the process. But looking at the alien now, he couldn't bring himself to finish the job. He had no illusions. The Zorveki were the enemy. They had come to Earth to conquer and destroy. They had no mercy for humans, and the thought of leaving one of them behind was unthinkable to most soldiers. Yet, as Carter looked at the alien, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. The warrior wasn't like the others. He wasn't standing tall with his weapons raised, ready to strike. He wasn't looking at Carter with hatred. Instead, the alien seemed defeated, exhausted, vulnerable. Carter took a deep breath. His training told him to be ruthless, to kill the enemy before they had a chance to fight back. But in this moment, something inside him whispered that mercy might be the better option. Slowly, cautiously, Carter reached for his pack. His eyes never left the alien as he rummaged through the supplies. He found a med kit and pulled it out, making sure to stay as quiet as possible. If the Zorveki reinforcements were nearby, they'd hear the smallest sound. They couldn't afford to get caught. The med kit wasn't made for alien physiology, but Carter had used it enough times to know how to make it work. He unwrapped some bandages and carefully began tending to the alien's wounds. The warrior didn't react, but his eyes followed Carter's every movement. It was as if the alien didn't know whether to trust him or not. After a few moments, Carter managed to stop the bleeding. The alien's breathing seemed to steady, but the warrior was still unconscious, lying in a crumpled heap on the ground. Carter wiped the sweat from his brow and took another look around. He knew this wasn't the safest place to stay. The Zorveki were relentless, and there was no telling when they'd find the wreckage of the human squad's last stand. He quickly glanced down at the alien again. The creature's life was fragile, but so was his own. Carter's decision to help the alien had put him in a vulnerable position. He wasn't just risking his life, he was risking his entire mission. But there was no turning back now. The warrior stirred. Carter instinctively reached for his rifle, but the alien's weak voice stopped him. Why? The voice was rough, almost unintelligible. The alien's glowing red eyes flickered again, but they weren't focused. Why? Help me. Carter hesitated. He had no answer. He couldn't explain it, not to the alien, and not to himself. But something in his heart told him that there was more to this war than simply winning and losing. Maybe there was more to this alien than just being an enemy. I don't know, Carter said softly, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe. I just can't leave you to die. The alien seemed to absorb his words, staring at him with those strange red eyes. They held an intensity, a deep sadness that made Carter feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: compassion. It was a strange feeling for a soldier, a feeling that hadn't made sense to him on the battlefield. But now, as he knelt beside the alien, it was undeniable. For a long moment, they both just looked at each other. The alien's expression remained unreadable, but Carter could sense that something inside the warrior had shifted. It was almost as if the alien was trying to understand Carter's actions, to understand why a human would risk his life for someone who had been an enemy only moments before. The silence was broken by the faint sound of footsteps in the distance. Carter's heart skipped a beat. The Zorveki were coming. They couldn't afford to stay here any longer. With a quick glance at the injured alien, Carter made his decision. He wasn't going to leave him behind. The mission might have been to eliminate the enemy, but Carter's actions had already spoken louder than orders. He was going to help the alien, no matter the cost. "Stay low," Carter whispered to the warrior, his voice urgent. "We have to move. I'm not leaving you here." The alien didn't respond, but Carter could feel the faintest shift in the air, almost like the alien was acknowledging his words. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Carter hope. Hope that this strange moment, this strange decision, might lead to something far more significant. Carter lifted the alien to his feet, bracing him against his shoulder for support. The warrior's weight was heavier than Carter had anticipated, but he didn't complain. Together, they moved silently through the wreckage, each step a battle of its own. The Zorveki were closing in, but for now, Carter had made a decision that no one else would understand. He was saving this alien, not as an enemy, but as a fellow soldier in the war for survival. The reluctant alliance. Carter moved as silently as possible, his heart racing with each step. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one thing was clear: he couldn't leave the Zorveki warrior behind. He had already made a choice, and now there was no going back. The alien, though badly injured, still walked beside him. Its movements were slow and cautious, but there was an underlying strength to it. Carter could feel the warrior's tense body, the silent tension that hung between them. The alien wasn't exactly in a state to fight, but its presence was undeniable. It was still a soldier, just like him. And Carter couldn't shake the feeling that their fates were now entwined. They made their way through the wreckage, using the remains of fallen soldiers and destroyed equipment as cover. Carter kept his eyes scanning the horizon, knowing that the Zorveki could be anywhere. He could feel them closing in, like a storm on the horizon. But with every step, he also felt something else, something he couldn't quite explain. The warrior beside him, though a deadly enemy just hours before, had become something more than that. It was almost like they shared a silent understanding, an unspoken bond formed by the chaos of battle. But what did it mean? Was it mere survival instinct, or something deeper? Carter didn't know. He didn't have time to analyze it. A sudden burst of static crackled through his earpiece, jolting him out of his thoughts. "Sergeant Carter, do you copy?" The voice of his commanding officer came through, sharp and urgent. "I copy," Carter responded, keeping his voice low. "Where are you? We've lost contact with you for over an hour. The Zorveki are closing in on your position." "I'm still alive, sir," Carter replied, glancing at the alien beside him. "But I've got company." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "What do you mean by company, Sergeant?" "I'm not alone," Carter said, his voice firm despite the situation. "I've got an injured Zorveki warrior with me. We're making our way to extraction." There was another pause. Carter could hear the incredulity in his superior's voice. "You've got a Zorveki with you. Are you out of your mind?" "I know what I'm doing," Carter said, his voice cold and steady. "Just get the extraction team ready. I'm not leaving without him." There was a heavy sigh on the other end. "This better not be a joke, Carter. If you're serious about this, we'll do what we can to extract you both. But you're taking a big risk." Zorveki aren't known for their mercy. I know that, Carter replied, glancing over at the alien again. The warrior was limping but still moving with determination. But I've seen something in him. He's not like the others. The radio crackled again, but the voice that came through was full of doubt. Understood. Get to the extraction point as soon as possible. We'll be waiting. And Carter? Yeah, he replied. Stay alive. Carter closed the channel, his mind focused. The path ahead was uncertain, but with the alien at his side, he knew they would face the dangers together. The two of them moved through the wreckage as quietly as possible, careful not to attract attention. Carter's muscles ached from the weight of the alien, but he couldn't afford to stop. He was responsible for getting both of them out alive, and he wasn't going to fail. Not now. The alien stumbled beside him, its breathing ragged, but Carter could sense that it was trying. The warrior's pride and will to survive were still there, buried under the pain and exhaustion. Carter found himself respecting that, respecting the warrior's resolve. It reminded him of himself, in a way. A soldier, trying to push through despite everything. They came to a small ravine, a natural barricade that offered some cover. Carter paused, scanning the area for any sign of danger. It was then that he noticed the alien looking at him, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Thank you, the alien rasped, its voice hoarse, for saving me. Carter's heart skipped a beat. The alien was speaking to him. And it wasn't just words of gratitude, it was something more. It was an acknowledgement of their shared struggle. Carter had saved its life, yes, but in doing so, he had also given it hope. We don't have time for this, Carter said, his voice gruff. We need to keep moving. But deep down, he felt something stir. A connection. Something beyond the battlefield. The warrior had trusted him in the most fragile moment of its life. And now, Carter had to honor that trust, even if it meant going against orders, going against everything he had been trained to believe. They continued forward, knowing that every step was taking them closer to the extraction point, but also closer to the inevitable danger. Carter had made his choice. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was fighting for something greater, something he hadn't realized he had been missing all along. Hope. It was a strange feeling, especially in the midst of a brutal war. But with the alien at his side, it felt real. It felt possible. The unlikely bond. Carter and the Zorveki warrior pressed on through the forest, the terrain becoming increasingly difficult as they navigated around fallen trees and crumbled rocks. The faint glow of the alien's eyes was the only light in the thickening night, casting eerie shadows around them. Carter's muscles screamed for rest, but there was no time. Every moment they lingered was another step closer to being found. We're almost there, Carter whispered, though he didn't know if the alien understood the words. But the warrior's limp had slowed, and he could tell the creature was feeling the strain. The creature was more than just a soldier. There was something different about it. The warrior wasn't fighting for glory, but for something more, something Carter didn't quite understand. His thoughts drifted as he kept moving forward, his instincts warning him of the dangers ahead. Zorveki soldiers were ruthless, warriors through and through, driven by survival and honor. Yet Carter had witnessed something different in this one. Despite its injuries and despite the brutal past of their two species, the warrior had trusted him. For that brief moment, when the alien had looked him in the eyes and whispered its thanks, Carter had seen a flicker of understanding, something shared between them in a world filled with violence. But it wasn't enough to stop them from being enemies. No matter how much Carter wanted to believe otherwise, the alien was still a soldier, a warrior of a race that had been at war with humanity for decades. They weren't allies. They were two survivors, temporarily bound by a single goal. Suddenly, the Zorveki staggered, its body giving way to exhaustion. Carter reached out instinctively, grabbing the warrior by the arm to steady it. The warrior's breathing was labored, its feet dragging against the rocky soil. No, no more, the alien said, its voice barely a whisper, filled with both pain and resignation. "I cannot. Go on." Carter's heart pounded. He had no time to stop. He had no choice but to keep moving. But the sight of the creature, injured, exhausted, and fighting to stay alive, stirred something inside of him. It reminded him of himself in a way. He had been through battles, through pain, through loss, and he knew this warrior was not so different from him. They were both survivors. He reached into his pack, pulling out the small medical supplies he had left. "Stay with me," he said, his voice firm. "I'm getting you out of here." The Zorveki's eyes flickered, its glowing light fading as the warrior fought to stay conscious. "Why?" it rasped. "You could leave me to die. You have no reason to help me." Carter's hands moved quickly as he wrapped a bandage around the alien's injured leg, the movements almost automatic. His eyes met the alien's, and for a moment, the question hung in the air. Why was he doing this? Why hadn't he just left the Zorveki behind? It would have been easier, safer. But Carter knew the answer. He couldn't abandon someone who had trusted him in that brief moment. He couldn't leave anyone to die, even if they were supposed to be his enemy. "You'd do the same for me," Carter replied, his voice low but steady. "I know you would." The Zorveki seemed to consider his words for a moment, its chest rising and falling with each shaky breath. Slowly, it nodded, though its eyes remained full of doubt. "Rest for a moment," Carter urged. "We'll move when you're ready." The warrior, though clearly struggling, managed a weak nod. It lowered itself to the ground, its back pressed against the base of a tree as it closed its eyes. Carter stood guard, his senses alert. The Zorveki's strength was fading, and there was no telling how long it would take before their enemies discovered them. The quiet of the forest seemed unnatural, the stillness suffocating. Carter's mind raced as he listened for any signs of movement. He could feel the weight of the alien's eyes on him, even though the creature's gaze had shifted to something distant. "I do not understand," the Zorveki said after a long pause. "Why have you shown me mercy? Your people have fought us for years." Carter exhaled sharply, his fingers gripping his rifle as he surveyed their surroundings. "We fight because we have to, because we're defending ourselves. But we don't have to be monsters." He paused, his voice softening. "I'm not saying we can be friends, but we can survive this together. Maybe that's enough." The Zorveki seemed to consider this, its glowing eyes narrowing slightly. "I was taught that humans are weak," it murmured, a trace of doubt in its voice. "But now, I am not so sure." Carter glanced back at the alien, the harsh words of his superiors and the propaganda about the Zorveki army flashing in his mind. It wasn't just the alien he had to question. It was the whole system, the whole war. For the first time, he felt the weight of their conflict differently, not as a soldier, but as a human being caught in the middle of it all. The warrior's body shifted, as if it was trying to stand, but Carter quickly stopped it. "Not yet," Carter said gently. "We'll wait for a little while. Then we'll go." The Zorveki's eyes held his for a long moment. "I will not forget this." Carter offered a faint nod, his heart heavy with a new understanding of the complexities of war. Survival wasn't just about fighting. Sometimes, it was about choosing who you helped, who you trusted. And in that moment, Carter chose to trust the alien, to believe in the fragile hope that they could both escape the war alive. They sat in silence for a while, the forest eerily still, each lost in their own thoughts. And though the night seemed endless, Carter knew one thing for sure. He had made the right choice. The desperate escape. Carter kept his eyes trained on the dark horizon, where the faint glow of enemy patrols flickered in the distance. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the forest, a constant reminder that they were not alone. They were not safe. But they had no choice but to keep moving. The Zorveki warrior was still struggling to stand, its legs barely able to support its weight. Carter's heart tightened as he watched the alien, his mind racing with options. They needed to move fast, but the warrior wasn't in any condition to fight or run. Every moment they delayed risked their discovery. "We can't stay here much longer," Carter muttered under his breath, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to find shelter." The Zorvaki made an attempt to rise, but its body was betraying it. The pain in its legs, the exhaustion, and the heavy breath it took made it clear. This battle wasn't just against the enemy anymore. It was against time itself. The warrior's skin was cold to the touch, and its body shivered with a mix of fever and fear. I will fight," the Zorvaki said weakly, its voice raspy but determined. "If you need me to." Carter turned to face the alien, his eyes serious but kind. "You don't have to. Just stay with me, and we'll get through this. We're stronger together." The warrior's glowing eyes flickered, a spark of something deep and powerful passing between them. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper. A mutual understanding. Despite everything, despite being enemies for years, they were both fighting for survival. They were two beings, both in the same struggle, and in this moment, there was no room for fear or hatred, only a shared desire to live. Carter quickly surveyed the area. He could hear the crunch of footsteps on the dry earth. Enemy soldiers. They were closing in fast. There wasn't much time. He grabbed the Zorvaki's arm and helped it to its feet, supporting most of the warrior's weight as they staggered forward. They moved swiftly but quietly, avoiding the open spaces where they could be easily spotted. Carter led them deeper into the trees, hoping the thick canopy would provide some cover. Every step was a risk. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The enemy was relentless, and their movements were getting closer. "We're almost there," Carter said under his breath. The shelter wasn't far now, a small cave he had found earlier when scouting the area. He'd left it unmarked, hoping it would be a secret refuge in case of an emergency. He only hoped it was still intact and safe. The sound of footsteps grew louder. Carter's pulse quickened. They had to make it to the cave before they were discovered. He pulled the Zorvaki forward, the warrior's body trembling but still pushing forward. Just as they reached the cave entrance, a blast from a nearby enemy laser rang through the air, followed by the sound of shouting soldiers. They had been spotted. Carter's heart raced. Without thinking, he shoved the Zorvaki inside the cave, rolling in after it just as another shot rang out, narrowly missing them. They were both in darkness now, the only light coming from the faint glow of the Zorvaki's eyes. "We're not safe yet," Carter muttered, his voice low. The Zorvaki's eyes scanned the cave, instinctively searching for any threats. It was a warrior's reflex. Carter pressed his back against the cave wall, trying to steady his breathing. Sweat dripped down his forehead. He strained his ears, listening for any sounds of pursuit. The seconds stretched on as the two of them waited in silence. The enemy soldiers could be close, but they had a slight advantage here. This cave had only one entrance. It was the only way in or out. "We need to keep quiet," Carter whispered. "They'll be looking for us, and they won't stop until they find us." The Zorvaki nodded silently, its body still trembling from exhaustion and injury. The warrior's breathing had slowed, but the faint rasp of pain in its chest was still audible. Carter glanced at the warrior, seeing the strain it was under. The Zorvaki's body was battered, and its strength was nearly gone. They needed to rest, but he couldn't afford to lower his guard. They couldn't stay here for long. "We can't stay here too long," Carter repeated, more to himself than to the warrior. "But we need to keep moving if we want any chance of surviving." The Zorvaki turned its head toward him, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "You've helped me. I owe you my life." Carter's lips curled into a tight smile. "We owe each other more than that. Let's just make sure we get out of here alive." The seconds felt like hours. The distant sounds of enemy patrols filtered in from the outside. Carter's eyes narrowed as he listened, his hands clenched around the rifle. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Every move counted now. Finally, the sounds outside seemed to fade. Carter exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It wasn't over yet, but they had bought themselves a little time. They were safe for now, at least. But even as he allowed himself a moment to relax, Carter knew that their fight wasn't over. The enemy wouldn't stop until they were found, and the Zorveki warriors' injuries would only make it harder for them to escape. Still, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that their bond had changed something deeper than just survival. It was a shared respect, a shared understanding of the harsh realities of war. He looked over at the Zorveki again, watching the faint glow of its eyes in the dim light of the cave. Whatever happened next, Carter knew they would face it together. A dangerous alliance. The air inside the cave was heavy, thick with the scent of earth and tension. Carter leaned against the cold stone, his rifle still clutched tightly in his hand, eyes scanning the shadows. His mind raced through the possibilities. Where would they go next? How could they escape the relentless enemy forces closing in on them? Beside him, the Zorveki warrior sat, its body still trembling from the injuries and the constant strain. The alien's once majestic armor had been severely damaged in the battle, leaving it vulnerable. But it wasn't just the physical wounds that were taking a toll on the warrior. It was the mental exhaustion, the weight of survival pressing on both of them. "I don't think we can stay here much longer," Carter whispered, breaking the silence. "The enemy will be searching the area, and we're not safe yet." The Zorveki's glowing eyes met his, and for the first time, Carter saw something different, something deeper. The warrior wasn't just a soldier anymore. It was an ally, a companion in this dangerous world. They had fought together, survived together, and in some strange way, they had become something more than enemies. "I can still fight," the Zorveki said, its voice low but determined. "I owe you my life, human. I will fight until I can no longer stand." Carter nodded, understanding the warrior's resolve. It was the same resolve that had driven him throughout his own military career. But this wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was about surviving. And to do that, they had to trust each other. The alien was strong, but it needed rest. And they needed a plan to escape and turn the tables on their enemies. "Rest for now," Carter said quietly. "We can't afford to burn out. I'll keep watch." The Zorveki hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, its breathing slowing as it leaned against the rock wall. Carter's eyes flicked between the cave entrance and the alien warrior, always alert, always ready for whatever came next. Every sound, every shift in the air made him tense, but he couldn't afford to fall asleep. Not yet. Outside, the sounds of the enemy patrols were distant but growing. They were close, too close for comfort. Carter knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, the enemy would find them. Minutes turned into hours as Carter sat there, his body aching from the long fight and the tension of waiting. His thoughts drifted, but he didn't allow himself to relax. He had to remain sharp. His hands clenched the rifle, and his mind ran through every possibility. The Zorveki, meanwhile, seemed to be slipping into a deep, exhausted sleep, its breathing even and steady for the first time since the battle began. But Carter knew better than to think they were safe. This moment of peace was fleeting. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness, a faint rustling, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps approaching the cave. Carter's heart skipped a beat. He grabbed the Zorveki's arm, shaking it gently. "Wake up," he hissed. "They're here." The alien stirred, its eyes flashing open, glowing brightly in the darkness. It immediately understood the danger, its body tensing with readiness. The Zorveki was weak, but its training and instincts kicked in. Carter quickly motioned toward the cave entrance. The footsteps were louder now, closer. The enemy had found their hiding place. The question was, how many of them were there? "I'll take the first shot," Carter whispered. "You get ready to cover me." The Zorveki gave a quick nod, its breathing steady despite the injuries. It was ready to fight again. The warrior's instincts were sharp, even in its weakened state. It had fought in battles across the galaxy, and now it would fight alongside a human. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with. Carter waited for the perfect moment. His finger hovered over the trigger as the sound of footsteps grew louder, just on the other side of the cave entrance. They were closing in fast. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the shadows outside. The first enemy soldier appeared, stepping into view. Carter didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger, the sound of the shot loud in the silence of the cave. The soldier crumpled to the ground, a clean hit to the chest. But there were more. More soldiers were stepping into view now, weapons raised. Carter could hear their voices shouting orders to each other. "Take cover," Carter yelled, pulling the Zorveki back deeper into the cave. He quickly fired again, hitting another enemy soldier. But there were too many of them. They were being outnumbered. The Zorveki moved swiftly, its body using what little strength it had left to launch itself into the fray. It moved with a speed and precision that Carter admired, taking out one enemy after another with deadly efficiency. The warrior wasn't going down without a fight. Carter kept firing, using the limited cover the cave offered. Every shot had to count. They couldn't afford to miss. His heart pounded as he watched the alien fight, its glowing eyes flashing in the darkness, its movements fierce and unrelenting. But it wasn't enough. The enemy soldiers were too many, and they had them cornered. Carter could hear their voices growing louder as they moved in, tightening their grip on the cave. They needed to escape. Fast. "Fall back," Carter shouted. "We need to get out of here." The Zorveki looked at him, its expression filled with determination and a touch of pain. It wasn't willing to retreat, but it could see the sense in Carter's words. They couldn't win this fight. Not here. Not now. With one final furious blow, the Zorveki knocked down an enemy soldier before grabbing Carter's arm and pulling him toward the rear of the cave. They were retreating. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As they dashed deeper into the cave, Carter's mind raced. The escape was far from guaranteed. The enemy was on their heels, and every step took them deeper into unknown territory. But Carter knew one thing for sure. They would face this challenge together. He looked at the Zorveki warrior, still fighting despite its injuries. It had proven its worth, and Carter had no intention of letting it fall. This fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The final stand. The cave walls seemed to close in around Carter and the Zorveki as they pushed deeper into the rocky labyrinth. Their only option now was to keep moving, to find a way out before the enemy caught up to them. But every step forward seemed to echo louder in the silence, and Carter could feel the weight of their enemies closing in on them. The Zorveki's breathing was labored, its body weakened from the earlier battle, but its spirit, its resolve, was unbroken. Carter's mind raced as he led the way, his heart pounding in his chest. The sounds of the enemy soldiers were unmistakable now, their voices growing louder, their footsteps heavier. They were getting closer. They wouldn't stop until they had found them, and Carter couldn't let that happen. The Zorveki gripped its weapon tightly, its eyes glowing with determination despite the pain from its injuries. It had fought through countless battles across the galaxy, but this was different. This fight was personal, and the human beside it, Carter, had proven to be more than just an ally. He had shown courage, tenacity, and strength in ways that the warrior hadn't expected. They were no longer just two soldiers thrown together by fate. They were a team, a force stronger than the sum of their parts. Carter turned sharply, finding a narrow tunnel leading further into the cave system. "This way," he urged the Zorveki, his voice low but urgent. They had to move quickly. The tunnel was their only hope of escaping the soldiers closing in behind them. The Zorveki followed, its body moving with quick, practiced steps despite its injuries. Carter didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. But he could feel the warrior's presence at his side, steady and unwavering. They had been through hell together, and they would face whatever came next together. As they moved through the darkened tunnel, the ground beneath them grew uneven, rocks and boulders making it difficult to keep their footing. The cave seemed endless, and the further they went, the more disorienting it became. But Carter couldn't slow down. They had to keep moving. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a massive cavern, its high ceilings disappearing into the darkness above. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of earth and dust. But it was too quiet. They had entered a trap. Without warning, enemy soldiers poured into the cavern from every direction, surrounding them in an instant. Carter's heart sank, his grip tightening on his weapon. They were outnumbered, and there was nowhere to run. The Zorveki's glowing eyes flicked between Carter and the soldiers, its body tensing in preparation for another fight. "Carter," the Zorveki murmured, its voice a low growl. "This is it. We can't keep running. This is our last chance." Carter didn't reply. His mind was racing, weighing their options. They could try to fight their way out, but there were too many of them. They wouldn't make it. But then he saw it, something in the shadows, a small opening in the far corner of the cavern. A way out, maybe, but it would take everything they had to reach it. "Follow me," Carter shouted, charging forward without waiting for a response. He didn't know if the Zorveki was behind him, but he couldn't waste any more time. Every second counted. He fired a shot, taking down one of the soldiers blocking their path, and then dashed toward the opening. The Zorveki followed, its movements swift and graceful despite its injuries, cutting down enemies as it went. They were almost there, just a few more meters to the opening. But then a shot rang out. Carter felt something cold and sharp slam into his side. Pain exploded in his chest, and he stumbled, barely catching himself against the wall of the cavern. "Carter," the Zorveki cried, turning back to help him. But the enemy was closing in, and there was no time to waste. "I'll be fine," Carter gasped, pushing himself back up. "We need to keep moving." With his side burning in pain, Carter fought through the haze of dizziness and pushed forward. He had to make it to that opening. They had to escape. The Zorveki was right behind him, its eyes blazing with intensity as it held off the enemy soldiers with fierce determination. But the fight was taking its toll on them both. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and the enemy was closing in with every passing second. Finally, they reached the opening. It was narrow, just wide enough for them to slip through. But before they could get to it, another group of soldiers appeared, blocking their escape. There was no way out, no more options. Carter's heart raced as he realized the gravity of their situation. He and the Zorveki were trapped, surrounded by enemies on all sides. It was over. They had fought, bled, and survived together, but there was no way out. But then, the Zorveki did something unexpected. With a sudden roar, it launched itself at the enemy soldiers, knocking them aside with a brutal force. It was a last-ditch effort, a final stand to protect Carter. "Get to the opening," the Zorveki shouted, its voice filled with urgency. "Now, human." Carter didn't hesitate. With all the strength he could muster, he dove toward the opening, feeling his injured side scream in pain. He made it through, barely, and turned back just in time to see the Zorveki dispatch the last of the soldiers. But the warrior didn't make it. It was overwhelmed by the sheer number of enemies and fell to the ground, its body limp. Carter's heart broke as he watched the Zorveki fall, its body surrounded by enemy soldiers. But he knew the fight wasn't over. He wouldn't let the Zorveki's sacrifice be in vain. He would get out of there, and he would return to finish the fight. With a last, lingering look at his fallen companion, Carter turned and ran. He wasn't alone. Not anymore.